Hello everyone, this is a revision video looking at the theory of oligopoly, oligopoly being a market structure, and specifically within this revision video, what I'm going to specifically look at is the characteristics of an oligopoly. So I'm going to recap those, but I'm going to spend most of my time focusing on the advantages and disadvantages of collusion. With 25 mark essay questions, you could be asked about the benefits and drawbacks of oligopoly, or you could be asked about the benefits and drawbacks of collusion. Are oligopolies desirable? Are they undesirable? Is collusion desirable or is it undesirable? What is the impact of collusion and what is the impact on the wider influences of an oligopoly market structure? So you will have your work booklet at the ready, and we will simply go through and recap some of the theory that we would have looked at in lessons with oligopoly. So some key notes looking at oligopoly characteristics. Oligopoly is a market structure in which a small number of large firms dominate the market. Now that's key, that word dominate. It's a market structure in which there's a small number of very large firms which dominate that market. There is a very high concentration ratio. Usually we would say a few firms adding up to about 70% of the market. So if we look at some examples, we look at the big four or the big five grocery stores. If you look at the grocery industry in the UK, you've got TESCO, Sainsbury's, Asda, Morrison's. Those would be your four large providers in that industry. Sometimes you look at the big four accountancy firms, for example. You can look at car manufacturing as well. There's a small number of very large car manufacturers out there. You look at, for example, telephone or mobile phone providers. These are industries which are very popular, and many of us purchase goods from oligopoly market structures, but we have a choice of only a small number of firms out there. But the key word there is dominate. You will remember from lessons that we often say that smaller firms can and do survive on the fringe of these much larger firms. They operate within the land of the giants, as we often say. In theory, the goods produced are differentiated. However, they can have a homogeneous nature, but they are heavily branded. The example I'm going to give you here is something like maybe a bank account. So if you take, for example, my bank account will do the same as what yours would. I would have a debit card. I would be able to purchase things online. I will be able to use online banking. I will be able to use an app on my phone. I could go into a branch and withdraw money if I wanted to. I can do transactions online, for example. I can withdraw from an ATM. So what my bank account can do is more or less the same as what yours can do. So therefore, the nature of the good is actually homogeneous. The difference is through branding, and there is a slight degree of differentiation. So for example, the interest rates on my savings account might be slightly different from the interest rates on your savings account. But my bank card will have the name of my bank on it. It will have the corporate colors of the bank there as well. I think companies like Santander, it's red. HSBC would be blue, for example. So the goods are differentiated, but they are heavily branded. Think about cars. A Volkswagen will take you to the same place as a Vauxhall car would, but there is differences there in branding, and there is slight differences in the fabric of the cars themselves. Firms are therefore price makers. So any firm that has a degree of differentiation in its product is able to act as a price maker. So they have the ability to set prices in that industry. We therefore would say that they possess monopoly power due to the unique nature of the product. Oligopolies, we say that there are very high barriers to entry and exit for the firm. Where you see oligopoly firms and monopoly firms, don't forget to mention the barriers to exit as well. So we say the barriers to entry, they are obstacles which would stop new firms from being able to enter into the industry. Barriers to exit are obstacles which would stop existing firms in the industry from leaving that industry. Entry by new firms is difficult and can be very expensive. There can be very high setup costs for oligopoly firms. If you think about it, it would be very expensive and difficult for you to become the next competitor to TESCO. It would be very difficult and extremely expensive to set up your own bank and operate within the same market share as that of HSBC, for example. It would be very difficult for you to automatically overnight to introduce your new brand of cars, for example. So these are industries in which it is very difficult for new firms to enter. It's also very difficult for for existing firms to leave those industries. Things like high sunk costs, for example, be very difficult to convert any type of physical assets into cash again. New firms, like all other market structures, they are attracted by those supernormal profits. So oligopoly, similar to that of monopoly, firms in an oligopoly are able to make supernormal profits. But high barriers to entry prevent them from competing away these profits. It's not like perfect competition. It's not a case of run in, take those supernormal profits because it's easy to get at them because of low barriers to entry. In oligopoly, barriers to entry are very high. They stop new firms from entering the industry, and therefore the barriers to entry, they protect the supernormal profits for existing oligopoly firms. Therefore, supernormal profits can be sustained in the long run. High barriers to entry within an oligopoly, they include high startup costs, very high sunk costs if you're looking to leave the industry. Oligopolies can experience very high economies of scale. They also can engage in limit and predatory pricing, even though those are illegal. And you will remember from lessons that limit pricing is when a firm, an existing firm, will set prices so low that that stops new firms from being able to enter the industry. New firms cannot enter the industry because prices are simply too low. Predatory pricing is when existing firms lower their prices and they do so with the intention of trying to push out other existing firms. So limit pricing stops new firms from entering. Predatory pricing is pricing strategies designed to push out existing firms, to almost break them and bankrupt them. There's also in oligopoly, we say, unlike all of the other market structures, there's a very high degree of brand loyalty. Consumers are very loyal to the brand that exists. In oligopoly, we talk about this idea of interdependence, and you'll remember this from lessons. Interdependence is specific to oligopoly. It's something that's quite unique to oligopoly. This is where the actions of one firm affect the actions of another firm. So therefore, in oligopoly firms, they're always watching out. They've always got to look over their shoulder as to what their competitors are going to do. The actions of one firm is very heavily influenced by the actions of another firm. There is, if you look at behavioral economics, there's an element of herding behavior here. What one firm will do will very much so influence the decision-making process of another firm. So in theory, interdependence in oligopoly is where firms make decisions based on the expected reactions of their rivals. If I do X, Y, and Z, how will my rivals react to that? If we do nothing, how will they react? And you're always looking to be the first mover in that market as well. Oligopoly is where firms fight for market share. So oligopoly can be a very aggressive market structure. There's a very high degree of competition, and competition strategies or competitive strategies can be very aggressive. So oligopoly is where firms fight for market share to try and increase their monopoly power, their ability to set prices. They are all fighting to increase that market share. They're all deliberately engaging in strategies to try and steal each other's market share, to see who can be the market leader in that industry. Firms therefore need to think carefully about how their rivals will react. So when making decisions, oligopoly firms will think, if we do this, this is how other firms are likely to react and behave. Think of the theory of the kinked demand curve. So I would encourage you possibly even to pause this video and maybe go and look at your notes for the kinked demand curve model, or also watch the video that's on the channel as well, which draws the kinked demand curve for you. And you'll remember from the kinked demand curve theory that if one firm were to raise their prices, the reactive behavior of all other firms is to keep their prices unchanged. If one firm raises their prices and there is competition in the market, there are other competing firms. If one firm raises their prices, they're the more expensive firm in the industry. Therefore, by default, consumers being rational and will say, well, I could get more or less the similar type of good with another company, with another firm. Therefore, I will leave the firm that has now raised its prices, and I will go to the firms that have kept their prices unchanged, because they, in comparison to the firm that's raised their prices, they are now the cheaper provider. It only makes rational sense that I purchase from the cheaper provider. On the other hand, if one firm were to lower their prices, all other firms, being rational, would also lower their prices as well. If one firm lowers their prices, they do so to remain price competitive. They do so to try and engage in price competition. I want to steal my competitors' customers. Therefore, one way to do that, if I know consumers are rational, I will lower my prices. I will attract them in by lower prices. I will steal their customers. All other firms, being interdependent, they don't want that to happen. They don't want their customers to be stolen from them. They don't want other firms trying to steal their market share. So as a result, as a consequence, all other firms will also make the reactive decision to also lower their prices in order to remain price competitive. And in that scenario, that provokes a price war. When one firm lowers its prices, all other firms also lower theirs. A price war will break out in that industry. In both scenarios, all firms will lose revenue. So let's have a look at the kinked demand curve model. I always really like this model when looking at the idea of oligopoly, for it's quite a simplistic diagram, and we know that in A-level economics, simplistic diagrams are few and far between, but it's a relatively straightforward diagram, but it opens up a huge amount of analysis when we look at different industries. So my ancient old tried and tested favorite scenario here is looking at, for those of you that I teach, you will know that I frequently make reference to the supermarket industry in the UK. So let's have an example. Let's look at an example of the price competition within these grocery industries in the UK. So let's look at TESCO being the #1 firm. So TESCO is the largest of all firms. TESCO has about roughly 27% of the market share, therefore classifying them as a legal monopoly because they have about 25% or more of the market share. So let's look at a decision that TESCO make. TESCO make the decision to lower their prices. Now I've put the kink demand curve to the left-hand side, and I've shown you where the kink is. I've lowered prices from P down to P2, and quantity has increased from Q to Q2. So TESCO has lowered their prices. They have made the decision to lower their prices. I'm also then going to look at the interdependence, the reactive behavior of their competitors. Now, in the grocery industry, we talk about the big four: TESCO, Asda, Sainsbury's, Morrisons. And Asda, Sainsbury's, and Morrisons will be watching very carefully at the decisions which TESCO have made. So TESCO decide to lower their prices. This is an independent strategy that TESCO has implemented. The directors, the company has all got together and they have said, let us now look at a strategy where we actively lower our prices. How then will Asda, Sainsbury's, and Morrisons react to that decision to lower prices? Well, they'll be thinking, well, if TESCO have lowered their prices, they now are the cheapest provider of groceries in the UK. That means that we, as Asda, Sainsbury's, and Morrisons, are now the more expensive providers. If we're the more expensive providers, our customers are going to leave us. Our loyal Asda, Sainsbury's, and Morrisons customers will leave those stores and start shopping at TESCO instead. So TESCO decided to lower their prices. All other firms, Asda, Sainsbury's, and Morrisons, they fear losing their market share. They're worried at the decision that TESCO has made. They're worried about the impact that's going to cause on their revenues and on their footprint into and out of their stores. All of a sudden, they could start losing their customers to go and buy their groceries from TESCO instead. So how do they react? Reactive behavior. All other firms will match the price cut. They will also lower their prices. So TESCO, if you look here, TESCO lowered their prices from P down to P2. As a result, all other firms, Asda, Sainsbury's, and Morrisons, will also lower their prices down to P2 as well. The reason for that is because it's reactive behavior. They do so because they fear losing their market share to TESCO. All firms share the increase in demand. And that's why demand is inelastic, because Asda, Sainsbury's and Morrison's and Tesco, because everybody now has lowered their prices, consumers who once shop with Asda no longer need to switch to Tesco because Asda has followed suit. And so therefore they remain with Asda, but they also get to benefit from lower prices. So we see a small increase in demand because consumers are likely to respond to that by continuing to buy the same goods they always bought before, but at lower prices. But they might buy slightly more of them because the goods are now cheaper. But they only experience a small increase in demand for Tesco. Hence why we have that kink in the demand curve. Part of it is elastic, but where we experience the fall in price, we experience an increase in inelastic demand. The overall result is that all firms lose revenue. So prices are likely to be sticky. So one of the things we conclude with the kink demand curve model is that it's actually irrational to either increase or lower your prices. Because if you increase prices, you lose revenue. If you lower prices, you also lose revenue. If a firm raises its prices, its consumers will switch to its competitors. Because remember, in oligopoly, there is a presence of competition. Even though there is a small number of large firms, just remember that number. There is a small number of firms. So therefore, a small number of firms indicates there's more than one. So it's not like a monopoly. There is a degree of choice. Consumers can switch to local competitors. So due to the price stability, so if we say it's irrational to either increase or lower your prices, then firms do not engage in a price war. So due to price stability, where firms don't increase or decrease their prices, where they don't engage in a price war, there is greater emphasis on non-price competition in the form of advertising, branding, and product and quality service. You take, for example, retail. Retail firms are all very tuned into the quality of customer service. Staff are heavily trained on the quality of customer service. By training staff, they're able to maintain their customers. By developing a strong brand loyalty, firms are more likely to sustain increases in market share and get ahead of their rivals. So what oligopoly firms will tend to do is try and not change prices. If one firm did lower them, they would be forced, their hand would be twisted. They would be forced to lower theirs, but they would spend a lot on non-price competition. So yes, you can buy the same goods at Tesco roughly for the same price as Asda, but you might experience a better quality in one of the two stores. So brand loyalty is very strong in oligopoly. So because of the kink demand curve model, because of the aggressive nature of competition, it leads us to this next interesting point in oligopoly. In oligopoly, it's a market structure in which firms can engage in this process called collusion, where they form a cartel. Now, collusion is the art of firms working together to make secretive agreements. A cartel is a group of firms who engage in the art of collusion, okay? So a cartel is a group of firms that engage in collusion. Collusion is the act, cartel is the formation of an actual group. So a cartel is defined as a group of firms that get together to make output and price decisions. So if oligopolies is very fragile, it's a very uncertain market structure. You don't know what's around the corner. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know how firms are going to behave, how firms are going to react. You don't know what's around the corner. And therefore, to reduce this uncertainty, to reduce the idea that we all are interdependent of one another. And if this is causing an absolute headache, if 1 minute we're making profits and then the next we're being forced to lower prices because new firms have entered, let's look at engaging in collusion. So firms get together to make output and price decisions. The conditions that give rise to an oligopolistic market are also conducive to the formation of a cartel. In particular, cartels tend to arise in markets where there are few firms and each firm has a significant share of the market. So where collusion is most successful in oligopoly industries in which there is only a very small number of firms. There has to be a very high concentration ratio. And of course, those small number of firms need to make agreements. Oligopolistic firms join a cartel to increase their market power. And members work together to determine jointly the level of output that each member will produce and or the price that each member will charge. By working together, the cartel members are able to behave like a monopolist. Now, the beauty of collusion is that once you understand what it is, when the firms do engage in collusion, they basically take on the behavior of a monopoly. So if you know your advantages and disadvantages of monopoly and your theory of monopoly, you will understand the theory of collusion. The cartel members choose their combined output at the level where their combined marginal revenue equals their combined marginal cost. So where MR equals MC, the point of profit maximization. And one of the things we say the cartel does, one of the main objectives of the cartel is joint profit maximization, where they work together jointly to maximize profits. The cartel price is determined by market demand curve at the level at output chosen by the cartel. So the level of output by the cartel is likely to be where MR equals MC. I would encourage you at this point to have a look or watch the video that looks at price fixing within a cartel, because that diagram is quite unique. Okay, it's a two-pane analysis where we look at the fixing prices within the cartel and how each firm then takes the fixed price agreement. So advantages of collusion. And you'll see, if you've already done the video on monopoly, you'll see, well, I've looked at this diagram, this exact diagram before, and you will find a lot of this is actually repetitive. Because when firms engage in collusion, they behave like a monopolist. And therefore, we say one of the main advantages of firms engaging in collusion is that they can be dynamically efficient. Because firms are making supernormal profits. Supernormal profits can be made in the long run due to the reduced uncertainty. Firms are no longer fighting towards each other. They're no longer worried about what actions each other firm is going to do. And therefore, they're able to form a complex monopoly. So a cartel acts as a complex monopoly. It is looking at reducing the fear of regressive competition. Joint and stable supernormal profits are made. So the agreement, when firms engage in collusion, the ultimate reason to engage in collusion is to reduce uncertainty and to joint profit maximize. By reducing uncertainty, by working together, now they are not merging. They are working together as separate organizations, but they share the same agreements with each other. So it could be 4 separate individual firms or 4 separate individual company names, but they act like a monopoly, and we call that a complex or virtual monopoly. These supernormal profits you can see from the yellow area in the diagram. Supernormal profits, therefore, can be reinvested back into the business in the form of technological progress or technological advances, research and development, innovative new products, for example. So the firm can take these supernormal profits and reinvest them back into the business. Consumers can receive a better quality good or service. What's the consequence of this reinvestment into dynamic efficiency? The consequence is better quality good or services for the consumers who have access to new innovative goods they did not have access to before. Okay, so these supernormal profits can be reinvested back into the company. If technological advances lead to lower cost of production, this could be passed on to the consumer in the form of lower prices. So I've always said this to you before, when we think about dynamic efficiency, don't always think of the default. It leads to better products. Think about how it could actually influence the production process. The technological advances could lead to lower costs of production. So lower cost of production could lead to lower prices. Remember, the firm could pass on these cost savings in the form of lower prices. If the firm introduces new products, this could lead to greater levels of choice for the consumers. And choice or consumer sovereignty would increase, increasing consumer utility. They're able to buy goods they were never able to buy before. For the cartel, the new product development can help to maintain their monopoly power, especially if there is a patent or copyright on the good, i.e. a legal barrier. So anytime a firm engages in dynamic efficiency, they're able then to set a patent or copyright or a legal barrier, which allows them then to benefit from long-term product development, because no other firm can copy this. No other firm can steal their ideas. So this is all well and good. Cartels, even though they are illegal, collusion is illegal. If they do engage in dynamic efficiency, it brings with it many benefits. However, let's look at our evaluation. What's the unintended consequences? However, there is no incentive to reinvest profits. It's likely to increase profits and exploit growing monopoly power. So if the firm engages in collusion, their number one objective in collusion is to joint profit maximize. And that is likely to be distributed to shareholders in the form of higher dividends. It means that each firm within the cartel jointly takes a slice of those profits. If you engage in collusion, you reduce competition, you forego competition. And by foregoing competition, there is no incentive then to compete. You've agreed that by colluding, you no longer engage in competition. So dynamic efficiency allows for a greater competitive environment. So if the nature of collusion is to reduce competition, then by default, the nature of collusion is to not be dynamically efficient. There is also no incentive to lower prices. The theory of collusion states that when firms do engage in collusion, they're more likely to engage in price fixing. Price fixing is likely to be at the profit maximizing level, where MR equals MC, which is not the allocatively efficient level. Prices are likely to be fixed at a higher rate, a rate which is higher than the socially optimum level of output. It is deemed irrational to be dynamically efficient in a cartel, simply because there's no incentive. There is no need to be dynamically efficient. A disadvantage of cartels. And this links nicely from the first point. And you'll see what I've done here is I've kept the same diagram. And what I would encourage you to do in your essays is to draw the one diagram, but make reference to it within the 2 points. So collusive oligopolies or cartels, they promote undesirable monopoly-style outcomes for society. So folks, basically this disadvantage of collusion is more or less the same as a disadvantage of a monopoly. Cartels agree to fix higher prices and restrict output. Cartels therefore produce outcomes which are allocatively inefficient. They set high prices and they restrict output away from the socially optimum level of output. So if I was to jump over to my diagram here, they restrict prices. They set high prices at P1 and they restrict output at Q1, the profit maximizing level of output. They do not set prices at P2, which is lower, and increase outputs to Q2, which would be allocatively efficient. They exploit consumers by abusing their newfound stronger monopoly power as a result of collusion. Prices are greater than marginal cost at the profit maximizing level of output. So this exploitation, collusion, leads to, and this is the reason why it's illegal, this is the reason why the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority, is set up to, this is the reason why CMA is there, is to protect consumers from the act of collusion, to spot it and to stop it, because it leads to the exploitation. Prices are greater than the marginal cost. At this point, resources are not allocated according to consumer demand, with consumers getting a lower quantity than they desire. Supply is not meeting with demand. It's leading to, and this should be screaming here, market failure. Please write that in if you're making additional notes. Consumer choice is restricted away from the socially optimum level of output. This reduces consumer surplus in the market, again, therefore leading to market failure. This creates a deadweight loss of both consumer and producer surplus. Remember that the deadweight loss area is made up of a loss of consumer and producer surplus. People are pushed out of the market. Only those that can afford the higher prices of P1 are able to purchase the good. It leads to inequalities. It could push some households into poverty, for example. Due to the agreed lack of competition, the quality of the good or service may also decrease, given the lack of competitive forces to meet the needs and wants
of the consumers. However, it depends upon how much of an increase in price consumers may experience. Sometimes the firms, when they do engage in collusion, they will fix a higher price, but the benefits of the higher price bring with it a greater investment in, for example, dynamic efficiency. Price fixing brings price stability, albeit at a higher price. This is, you're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place here. What would you prefer? Constant fluctuating prices, or through price wars? 1 minute you're in a price war, next minute they're up, next minute they're down. Or would you rather a fixed high price and a stable high price? If the cartel is allocatively inefficient, they maximize more supernormal profits. These could be reinvested back into the company, improving the good or service. However, it's unlikely. So we have this conflict of objectives here. If you achieve the objective of allocative efficiency, you forego the objective of dynamic efficiency. Collusion is ultimately illegal. So even though we're talking about the depressing state of allocative inefficiency within the industry, the CMA is out to stop this from happening. So collusion is illegal, and the CMA will investigate if cartels are operating. The CMA is protecting the consumer. So even though we know collusion leads to allocative inefficiency, we also know, or we have the comfort of knowing, that the CMA, or the Competition and Markets Authority, a regulatory body, is set up by the government intervention to stop oligopolies from abusing this monopoly power. Another disadvantage of collusion is other different types of inefficiencies. And we're going to look specifically at productive inefficiency and X inefficiency. So cartels do not produce at the lowest point of the ATC curve. They are productively inefficient. They do not operate at the minimum point of the ATC, the lowest point of the U-shaped ATC curve. Instead, they choose other objectives like profit maximization, for example. They choose instead to voluntarily forego some of those economies of scale. So if they're not being productively efficient and they're being productively inefficient, they are not maximizing their economies of scale. They are not operating at the lowest point of the ATC curve. Output could be increased further with lower average costs, but as this does not correspond with profit maximization, where MR equals MC, productive inefficiency occurs. So the firm has two choices. Do we operate at the lowest point of ATC, where MC, marginal cost, is equal to the average total cost curve? Or do we operate where MR equals MC and maximize our profits? The latter will always normally be the main objective. As a consequence, the firm is not incentivized to lower costs. Thus, consumers are likely to face higher prices and lower consumer surplus than if all economies of scale were exploited. So because they're productively inefficient, they do not exploit economies of scale or fully maximize their economies of scale, and therefore there is no incentive to lower costs. Therefore, you cannot pass on those lower costs to consumers in the form of lower prices. I always look at the situation of, it's one where consumers could experience lower costs, but that choice is down to the firm. The ability to pass on lower costs and pass on lower prices is there, but there's not always a willingness to do so. Cartels, like many monopolists or monopolies, can also be X inefficient. This is because they become complacent in the production process, allowing unnecessary waste. So because cartels reduce competition and the fear of competition, the fear of stealing market share, and they reduce that aggressive competitive environment, they are likely to become more complacent. They're likely to be X inefficient. They lead to unnecessary waste. Staff members can become lazy. They can make many mistakes. Resources are not always used in the most efficient way. As a consequence, further, consumers suffer from higher prices and lower consumer surplus. Cartels are also likely to experience diseconomies of scale, simply because of the size of the cartel. Remember, larger organizations, and certainly larger cartels are very difficult relationships to maintain. They become very complex situations because they become very large-scale organizations and complex organizations. However, let's look at our evaluation of these inefficiencies. Even though cartels are productively inefficient, they may still be exploiting greater economies of scale than smaller competitive firms who produce lower levels of output, given the larger degree of competition in the market. So what we're saying here is, well, it's better to exploit some economies of scale than not to exploit any at all. So you're sort of saying, even though they don't fully maximize economies of scale, they still are exploiting some degree of economies of scale. And the degree of economies of scale they do exploit are likely to be greater than those we would see in smaller competitive firms, like those in monopolistically competitive markets, and those certainly in perfectly competitive markets. So even though the cartel is not ideal, it will experience greater economies of scale. Costs of production can often be lower for cartels compared to competitive firms, resulting in lower prices charged and higher quantities produced, actually promoting better outcomes for societies. So in actual fact, some cartels can think smarter about their prices and their output strategies. Even under conditions of collusion, firms still may be incentivized to break the colluded agreement or cheat. So even though they agree to collude and to fix prices, remember, one of the biggest issues with collusion is that there will always be an incentive, normally in the long run, or surely in the long run, to engage in cheating strategies, where you almost say, look, I've had enough of playing ball. I've had enough of making these agreements. I could, if I broke the colluded agreement, actually make more supernormal profits. They may be more keen to be allocatively efficient if they wish to now compete, lowering prices and increasing output to meet consumer demand. So if the firm that is engaged in collusion all of a sudden does decide to say, do you know what, I'm going to break the colluded agreement and I'm going to engage in aggressive competitive strategies again. One of those competitive strategies could be being more productively efficient and reducing inefficiencies, because now with the incentive to cheat, it now actually makes it better to engage in more productive efficiencies. So overall, what do we feel? What's our overall consensus with collusion? You'll remember in the final stage of your essay, you will have to write about discon. A final conclusion, looking at overall, do we agree or disagree with collusion? Do we like or do we dislike oligopolies? Is collusion right or wrong? Is it desirable? Is it undesirable? Now, dependent upon the context that you're looking at, and obviously you are allowed your opinion here as well, but you have to make a decision. Overall, do we like collusion or not? First of all, I think we have to get this down here because it's right that we mention this. But when we decide overall collusion is illegal, the reason it is illegal is because it is normally always intended to exploit the consumer. It's normally the act of collusion is normally always there and designed to abuse monopoly power. So when firms engage in collusion, they do so to fix higher prices with the intention of joint profit maximizing. So you have to ask yourself the question, who is really benefiting from collusion? In real terms, let's be honest, the person or the group that benefits most from collusion is the firm, and they benefit through the exploitation of consumers. It depends upon the number of firms. So the degree of collusion, the degree of the strength of the cartel, the aggressiveness of the cartel, the success of the cartel will depend upon the number of firms within it. If there are a small number of firms in the industry, then this will make it easier for firms to collude and agree on fixing prices. So if you've got smaller numbers of firms in competition, you've got smaller numbers of people to agree with. That's less people to agree with. And sometimes that can actually fuel greater levels of collusion. It depends upon the degree of barriers to entry. If barriers to entry within the oligopoly market structure are high, supernormal profits made by the cartel can be sustained in the long term, increasing the incentive for firms to get together and fix prices and set quantity quota. So if barriers to entry are high, it reduces even more the ability of new firms to enter, and therefore it almost leaves the firms that are in the oligopoly market structure almost within a protected layer, and that therefore strengthens their ability to engage in collusion. It also depends upon, and this is a key one, the degree of competition policy. So governments have competition policies set up to regulate the power of oligopolies. So it depends upon the degree of competition policy. If the competition policy is ineffective, let's say, for example, the regulatory body, for example, the CMA, firms may feel that the risk of getting caught is much lower, and so are more likely to engage in collusion and cause even greater damage to consumers. So if the degree of competition policy is actually quite weak, if the CMA as a regulatory body is quite weak at regulating the behavior and finding out the behavior, and if regulation policy is not strong enough to stop this type of behavior, then firms almost act a bit like a law on themselves. They think that the risk of getting caught is reduced, and therefore they're more likely to engage in collusion. There's a greater incentive to engage in illegal behavior if you know that the risk of getting caught is relatively low. In the short run, the cartel can be dynamically efficient. So that's a good point. That's all well and good. In the short run, yes, they can be dynamically efficient. Sometimes they will be dynamically efficient to try and throw people off the scent that they are engaging in collusion. So let's engage in collusion. Let's do something nice for the consumer. Let's improve the quality of the good, and let them know that we're trying to compete when secretively, behind the scenes, we're actually engaging in collusion. However, in the long run, they are likely to pursue the objective of profit maximization and become allocatively inefficient and abuse their monopoly power. Firms, though, may get caught in the long term. The CMA will eventually catch up with them. Many companies have been caught colluding. Many companies have been fined engaging in collusion. Remember, that's one of the drawbacks of engaging in collusion, is that firms can face very heavy fines if they're caught engaging in collusion. The fine normally is a reflection of the amount of money that the firm made from exploiting consumers through engaging in the art of collusion. Our ultimate recommendation is that because collusion is illegal, we continue to make it illegal in the UK. We recommend that the government increase the resources and power of the CMA. We believe that the Competition and Markets Authority should regulate and should have greater power in regulating competition. You could also recommend as well that governments introduce policies to reduce competition within those markets. If collusion is beneficial to society, then we recommend policy which encourages cooperation, or we encourage policies that encourages firms to compete through things like non-price competition, but not encourage them to engage in collusion. Okay, that was a very comprehensive overview of oligopolies and particularly the art of collusion. I hope you find that useful. I hope you find it useful, particularly with your essays, and I wish you the very best in your exams. Good luck with your revision. I hope that's helped.